Mystery authors Owen Laukkanen and Nick Petrie, in partnership with the Carytown Book Fest.
Well, first, I have to say that I'm a little annoyed by this book because usually when I do this kind of thing, I can come up with questions as I go. I sort of pause. There are places where I stop reading and I think, oh, well, I could talk about that or I should ask about this. But this book just races right along, and I really couldn't come up with any questions as I read. So there aren't really great questions that I have. Just letting you kind of lower your expectations for the day.
These people aren't going to judge you.
I hope not.
It's a safe space.
Oh, yeah, well, he might. So why a book? Why this book and not? I know you're a fan of dogs and trains, and so why a boat book? Why this particular book?
Yeah. So for those who don't know, Gale Force is a book about like the deep sea salvage industry, and when you say that to people, their eyes kind of glaze over, especially in like I did an event in Arizona, and people just didn't get it, but I was in Maine earlier this week and people were all about it. So I'd always wanted to go to sea. I came from like a family of fishermen and boat builders, and I'd always wanted to work on ships and travel the world that way. But I'm colorblind, and colorblindness precludes you from getting a navigation certificate. So
I didn't know that.
Yeah, neither did I until I took the Transport Canada certification test after I'd been accepted to Maritime Academy. And
that's kind of a long way to get through before finding that
out. Yes, my dreams just crumbled into dust right there. Yeah. So, but I'd always wanted to write about the sea. I think, my dad had, when I was a kid, he would take me down to the harbor to watch freighters go by, and I grew up in Windsor, Ontario, so we'd walk down to the Detroit River and watch the lake boats go by. And then I'd go home at night, and my dad would read me from like Joseph Conrad or some sea tale. And so literature and the sea have always gone together for me. And I always wanted to write something, a deep sea adventure. And in my off time between writing Stevens and Windermere books, my FBI series, I thought I would write a really pulpy nautical adventure about a group of dudes who go out to sea and try to make a fortune by rescuing a salvage ship or a shipwreck. And this is what it turned into.
Well, and they're not all dudes, right?
No, they were at first. It was just a group of dudes on a tugboat, like a group of interchangeable middle-aged dudes. And so, like, salvage is really interesting because when a ship gives out a distress signal or whatever, or is abandoned because of distress, it's automatically open season to whomever can get out there and put a line on it and save the ship. Bring it into shore. So what you have is literally these teams of people who just hear that a ship has gone, haywire, and congregate from all corners of the globe onto a tugboat, race out in their tug to the middle of nowhere to save the ship. And if they get there first, they're entitled to like between 10 and 75% of the ship's value. A ship is worth about $100 million. So, first prize is paying you, $30 million. Second prize pays nothing, and if you can't save the ship,
right, you're out all your expenses. Fuel cost for a 110-foot tugboat is not insignificant.
It's a huge gamble, and it attracts gamblers. And so I wrote the book based on that, thinking, there's this real life story. When you go home tonight, Google the Cougar Ace. It's this, it was a 600-foot freighter that carried 5,000 Mazda cars, and it tipped over on its side 200 miles off the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, and people had to go up and try to figure out what had tipped it over, go into the very bottom of the ship, figure out how much water was on board, figure out how to pump it out, and then pump it out 200 miles from land in the middle of a storm so it was upright and bring it into safety. And I thought that excitement would be enough to counteract the fact that it was just a bunch of boring dudes sailing out to sea. And I showed my publisher, and the publisher really liked the part where the ship had to, in the storm, but the dudes, they said, could you have a few female characters in it? And so...
Fewer dudes.
Fewer dudes, that was the note, very concise. Which is usually not a problem for me as a writer, and I'd wager not a problem for you either. You have strong female characters in your...
Oh yeah, I grew up with strong women, so it's kind
Sure.
of a default for me. My mom's nickname at work was the Hammer. It's, yeah. So my sister is kind of a force of nature. I married a woman who a friend of mine calls Hurricane Margaret.
From the hammer to the hurricane.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So yeah, life is too short to be bored, right? So, and I think that's interesting. I do worry. I have people who say, "Oh, you write women really well," but I also sort of people who don't want to see a man writing a female character, which is. So am I only allowed to write about middle-aged white men? I mean, that's I'm not very interesting personally. And when you reduce that entirely, what am I only supposed to write about myself? So then I'm limited to memoir. So. That's not really, I don't really do facts very well, so.
Right, yeah. I mean, I think my approach to writing anything other than, boring upper middle class white man is to try to look at the commonality between everyone and to look at the fact that we all, I don't think you want to appropriate someone's story, or certainly I don't, but I think, so this book, the captain was a dude, and
Are there two U's in dude?
yeah, sometimes three, depending on the context. By and large, the things that he was worried about are pretty much the same as what McKenna, the eventual captain of the ship, is worried about, which is to say, she's worried about getting this ship upright. She's worried about, keeping her business solvent. And she's worried about the lives of her crew that are in her hands as she sends them into the ship to try to rescue, to try to, pump it out. So, I think it's. I'm not going to. Yeah, I think I'm not trying to appropriate a voice, but I think when I write women, and I think when you write women too, you can just channel the stuff that we all have in common.
Well, sure. I mean, the goal is to find some piece of yourself and to kind of blow it up, right? So yeah. She's concerned about living up. Her father ran the tug before her, and she's concerned about sort of living up to the standard that he set. She's worried about, is she a good captain? I mean, those are all things that everybody sort of is concerned about. So, I mean, those really are universals.
And I mean, so eventually the main character of this book became McKenna Rhodes, who's a 33-year-old woman who grew up on the water and inherited the boat from her dad, as Nick says. And to kind of inspire that, I drew on this experience of this woman who I met on the train between Seattle and Los Angeles. And if you've ever ridden Amtrak long distance, you know that they have enforced socialization in the dining car, where you have to.
Oh, right.
You have to talk to people. You can't just sit by yourself.
That's hard for most writers.
It is.
Yeah.
Well, and I don't know if you found this, Nick, but when people find out you're a writer, they want to talk a lot about you and your life.
Yeah, but I'm more interested. I'm not really interested.
No,
in my
exactly.
life. I'm interested in other people.
I've had experiences where I've talked at a party for like 2 hours about myself, which is not terribly difficult for me. And then at the end, I asked the guy, the person, what he did, and he literally told me, he said, "Oh, I don't have an interesting job." I said, "Well, try me." He said, I'm an earthquake consultant. I said, "All right." You should have cut me off an hour and a half ago.
Yeah.
But so on this train trip, I was talking about the life and times of being a writer for most of this Amtrak meal, and then at the end, I asked my companion, who was kind of a middle-aged woman, what her life was about, and she had another fascinating story. She had been someone who, in the 80s and 90s, she had been a single mother in Idaho, a single mother of 4, and in order to feed her family, she'd started a long-haul trucking company in Idaho.
Oh my gosh.
Which, I mean, you can imagine is something of a boys' club as much as deep sea tugboating, and to the point that this woman's trucks were sabotaged and her contracts were blocked, and she just had to fight tooth and nail with these bigger male-dominated companies to make inroads. And by the time I talked to her, those kids were in college. Their degrees were paid for by her trucking company. She had taken her company, it spanned the Pacific Northwest, and she was riding first class on this Amtrak train while paying someone else to run her company. So, it was pretty inspiring tale of perseverance, and I
Right.
thought I'd like to channel something like that into my characters in this, as opposed to just being,
A bunch of dudes.
a bunch of dudes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So McKenna doesn't have kids, but she's young. She's trying to make inroads in this business. She's up against men who've been established in it for a long time and who have an interest in keeping her out of it. And so I really tried to channel, this woman's experiences into McKenna.
Well, one of the other things I really liked about this book was how much I'm a strong believer that when you're writing about crime, you have to have it has to be about
criminal
something.
record.
Yeah, well, no, that too. But it has to be about something. There has
Yeah.
to be what I inelegantly call aboutness, right? So this book has all of this sort of maritime stuff and ship stuff, and you do it so well, it just gets sort of folded in that suddenly it's as if you always knew as you read this. There's not a learning curve. That's one of the things I really admired reading this, was how effortlessly it seemed anyway that you had kind of rolled this
Thanks.
information into the story. So you went out to sea with some. I mean, I know that you've done that in your younger days. You were a commercial fisherman.
Yeah. My grandfather was a commercial fisherman. My uncle was a commercial fisherman, and so I spent a lot of summers on their boats. And then my dad, who's an oncologist by trade, had a midlife crisis a few years ago and bought a lobster fishing boat in Atlantic Canada. And so for a number of years, he would fish for lobster in the mornings and then drive into the city and put on a lab coat and treat patients in the afternoons. And he's since slowed down. He was treating patients all spring, and right now he's out on the lobster boat. But so I worked with him. I worked on boats quite a bit on both the Pacific and Atlantic coast.
And so did you go out to do research? Did you go out on a tug, or did you talk to people? Was that, or are you really just drawing on your earlier experiences?
Like by and large, it was drawing on being on fishing boats on the West Coast. I think the wonderful thing about the maritime world is that, and for me it was fishing, is that you fish all day and then there's a storm comes up and you have nothing to do but sit on your boat and trade stories. And so I was like 22, listening to these old salts trade war stories deep into the night while the wind howled through the rigging outside. And then as soon as it was done, I'd scurry down to my bunk with a notebook, try to write down as much as I could about it, because it was just priceless stuff. So a lot of it just came from being immersed in the environment. I'm hoping that if there are more books in the series, like the next one, I'm hoping will take place in the Strait of Malacca, which is near Singapore, and it's the most heavily pirated stretch of water in the world. It also happens to be the stretch of water where 25% of all the world's consumer goods pass. So I'd like to set a book there, and I'd like to go visit this pirate-infested water.
Well, I think you have to.
I mean, you do. Yeah. Even if no book comes of it, it's just for the story.
Well, I'm a fan of research, even if it takes a while for things to kick in.
I think I read Light It Up, Nick's latest book. When did it come out? January?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I read it pretty much as soon as it came out. And what you were saying about the maritime stuff, I felt like you wove in the legal pot environment, legal marijuana environment in Colorado just to a.
Well, thank you. It was so much fun to do because not for the reasons
How much research did you do?
No, I have asthma, and B, I use my brain for a living. So, but I love to sort of dive into something, and it's so much fun to try to convey that on the page and to do something that you don't see all the time. That book started in kind of a goofy way. I was in an airport, just like you were on a train. I was in Phoenix on tour for my first book, and I was supposed to be writing about Detroit. And I was really frustrated by this book. I'd written the same 10,000 words over and over again, and I really was getting nowhere with it. And then I was getting coffee, and I started talking to a guy who was on his way to Portland, Oregon, to start a cannabis grow. And I said, gee, how did you get this is kind of just newly legal, how did you get the experience to do this? there was sort of this long pause, and he said, well, this is my first legal cannabis grow. And he was kind enough to share a lot of details of his life with me, and I stayed in touch, and we've done some email and phone conversations back and forth, and that a lot of sort of details from his life, tweaked and changed to fit my own requirements, because writers are kind of mercenary that way. But I found its way into. I mean, this is like stuff you just can't make up.
Right. Yeah.
But that was a lot of fun to do, and it's fun to sort of take something that you know a little bit about and learn a lot more about.
It is, yeah, and I think to fashion, kind of a thrilling, entertaining story out of this really fascinating, world.
Well, it goes back to that aboutness part, right? So
Yeah.
my mom was a big Dick Francis fan, and she says that she likes Dick Francis because she always learns something. She learns about horses. She learns about the racing world, and I think that's really true. I loved early Clive Cussler, right? So that's what this reminded me of a lot. Raise the Titanic was one of those books for me that just kind of was like, wow, you can write this stuff? You can tell these kinds of crazy stories? And now I know people who write with him, which is crazy.
Yeah. I mean, they always say write the book that you want to read, right? And for my money, there's not enough early Clive Cussler out there. Like, I remember reading this Wilbur Smith book called The Hungry Ocean, which came out in the 70s, and it's about a disgraced salvage tug captain venturing into Antarctica to rescue a cruise ship with 600 people on it, and huge storms and drama, and it's amazing. And I read it, and I thought, oh my God, Wilbur Smith is my new guy. I'm going to look up everything else he's ever written, and everything else he's ever written takes place in South Africa on land.
So that's unfortunate.
Yeah, so when I sat down to write this book, I thought, okay, Clive Cussler does this. Who else? Is there a market for anything else?
Well, so what my publisher thinks I write are thrillers. But thrillers are a relatively new designation, right? They used to be called adventure novels.
Right.
Men's adventure was what it used to be called. And so a thriller has a little more, style, maybe sounds a little more modern, but that's basically what we're writing is adventure stories.
It's true.
So you go back to, I'm trying to think about who else that I read that wrote that kind of stuff. Well, my favorite seafaring books are the Patrick O'Brian books. I don't know if you've read those.
Yeah. Master and Commander, what are the...
Oh my God, yeah. So there are something like 21. They're set in Napoleonic era. He's a British naval officer, and you follow him from being a young lieutenant all the way up to being an admiral. And
Aubrey.
Yeah, Jack Aubrey.
Yeah.
And he folds all of this crazy. I mean, I feel personally that I could sail a 3-masted warship myself. I mean, it's like being there. I mean, and he takes you from, the Roaring Forties in Antarctica to, Fiji and India, and it's like traveling the world in the early 1800s. So those books also, really kind of are reminiscent as well. It's that here's the world, let's have an adventure kind of book.
Yeah.
So how was writing this different from writing Stevens and Windermere? So was the process different?
Kind of. I mean, when I set out to write this book, I set out to write, like I said, something pulpy, because it was in my spare time between essentially my day job. And the last time I'd done that, I wrote these YA books, like young adult books that are immensely inappropriate.
But a lot of fun.
I mean, they're fun. They were fun to write. The first one is like 50,000 words, and I think the F word is used 280 times. I mean, anyway, we could talk about the YA stuff, but so I wanted to write something different from the Stevens and Windermere books. So this, I thought I would write it pulpy. I thought it would have publish it under a weird pen name, like a weird, like Anchors Away, or in a paperback original, something just noxious. I wrote it in present tense, which I never do, and I try. So it's essentially team tugboat with McKenna and the dudes go up to Antarctic or go up to Alaska to the ship that's tipped over and has a bunch of cars on it, and they have to try to figure out how to get it upright again. But my nod to the pulp factor was I put $50 million worth of stolen Japanese mafia money on board and one stowaway who no one knows is there, but who will obviously stop at nothing to protect his $50 million. So, it's in bearer bonds, which I think is like the hackiest refuge of a crime writer. But in my defense, I was reading The Wolf of Wall Street at the time, and that guy Jordan Belfort makes such a strong case for using bearer bonds to launder money that I thought I had to use it. So
that's how I launder all my money. I think it should be a tried and true.
I thought it was in sport coats. You just roll.
No. I only own 3. It's hard to put all your money, and the pockets are only so big. So I
that's
can't,
true.
Yeah.
So I tried to write it, kind of as an over-the-top adventure novel, and then I showed it to my publisher, Putnam, who published my Stevens and Windermere books, and they were on board with it being not a pulpy novel, or kind of more of a legitimate novel. So I went back and tried to tone down the pulp.
You depulped it?
Yeah, I tried to make it more respectable in some ways, but the bearer bonds stayed. The shootout at the Dutch Harbor Saloon did not.
Aw, I would have liked to have read that.
For the sequel.
There you go. But so now so the Windermere, Stevens and Windermere novels, are those plotted out? I mean, those are, I won't say they're not a traditional anything, but they have, you have a FBI person and you have a Minnesota, basically BIA, Minnesota version of the FBI, working together. So they're really law enforcement, not procedurals, because they're quite different from each other. But so is that a different process than from writing a pulp adventure novel?
Yeah. I think you talk about aboutness, and for me, those books are finding something that interests me or something that fascinates me, and then writing something around it. I never set out to write. I never wanted to write a serial killer novel because I just don't. I think
it's hard to get a date.
It is. Yeah. It's a shame because my mom is a forensic pathologist, so I have so many stories about murder, but none that I want to tell. And I think that there's a lot of violence against women in crime fiction that is done gratuitously and done in a way that's, there's a lot of dead sex workers in crime fiction, and it's not because crime writers are concerned about the plight of the sex worker. It's because there's something sick going on, and I never wanted to write that kind of novel. But my 6th Stevens and Windermere novel is about a serial killer, and it came about when I moved to a neighborhood in Vancouver that had been terrorized by a serial killer for two decades. The man had killed 49 women, and they were prostitutes. They were largely poor, and they were largely drug addicts. And so the response literally from the community and from the police department was, your daughter was a drug addict, what did she think was going to happen? Or, your sister was a prostitute, she should have known this was coming. And, obviously that's bullshit. So I moved to this neighborhood. I walk my dog through this neighborhood, and the beautiful thing about having a dog is dogs are such a humanizer. So it doesn't matter if you're walking past someone in a suit or someone with a crack pipe, they're still going to say hello to your dog, and you're going to strike up a conversation. And so I would strike up a conversation with the people, who'd kind of lived through these decades of experience. And I walked Lucy past Lucy being my dog, past the memorial rock for these women, and invariably there would be a stuffed animal or a poem from someone's, daughter or something, just something heartrending, and something that really emphasized the humanity of, that these were human beings who deserve more than to be written off by the police and by society. And I really wanted to write something that gave some agency to those women because invariably the stories that they had to tell, and I read a bunch of the stories of these women who'd survived or who'd been victims of this guy, and they were heartbreaking and just fascinating. And these were human beings with hopes and dreams and families, and a lot more than met the eye. And so I wanted to write something. And so The Forgotten Girls was kind of my response to that, working it into the framework of a Stevenson Windermere FBI novel set in the States. So it's essentially about a young woman whose best friend is victimized by a serial killer in Montana, and she ventures into the Montana wilderness in the dead of winter to try to track this guy down. And Stevenson Windermere, my cops, are also part of it, but by and large, my books, I think Stevenson Windermere kind of are there to satisfy the publisher, and then there's what I want to talk about and the story I want to tell is.
Yeah. Well, when you're writing a series, I think it's really hard to continue to entertain yourself as you write. I mean, I'm lucky in that my editor has never said do X, Y, or Z. I basically promised that the book is going to be about one thing, and then 12 months later, I delivered an entirely different book. And she says, "Hey, this is great." So I am lucky, but I know a lot of writers who, we want the story to be about this. We want the story to be about that. But I think a lot about kind of how I want that, what I want the components of the series to be, to allow myself to tell bigger stories or smaller stories.
Sure.
Or stories. So my main character is a guy named Peter Ash, and he's a Marine Corps veteran who has post-traumatic stress that takes the form of claustrophobia, so he can't really be inside for very long, which is a more interesting conceit than being agoraphobic, because for me, I wasn't really interested in telling a thriller about a guy who can't go outside. Maybe that's just me, but
No, I think the claustrophobia is such a fascinating part of it, and you write it so well. You write it to the point that as a reader, because he gets this ringing in his ears, right, of the white noise.
Yeah, the white static. Yeah.
Whenever he goes inside, and as a reader, it's channeled through the page into your own.
Well, I had a guy that I know who is an Iraq War vet, who has post-traumatic stress, who told me that reading the book basically triggered his symptoms. And so I apologized. He said, no, because I'm actually working to he's working to put himself into those situations so he can calm himself back down. But that was a weird compliment, but it was a compliment that I had done something well enough. So I wanted him to, and I, like you, I didn't really know that I was writing a series.
I was going to ask if you set out to write a series.
No, I wrote this book, and I thought, well, that's going to be it, and now we'll do something else. And they said, we really like this one. We write another one. So I actually didn't have to do much to it. I had been reading series for so long that I think, and in part I sort of thought, well, this is how this may go or may not, and I somehow built some of that DNA in place, but so he doesn't have a fixed address, which is a challenge because there's not a set group of characters. There's not a home to return to. So I've given myself more work as a writer because each book takes place in a different city or location.
Yep.
But at the same time, I'm not stuck with, if you're writing a police procedural set in Boston, there's a dead person in the first chapter, and then it's, so I wanted to avoid all of those traps. And so far, I've written about all kinds of different things in all kinds of different places. But so did you think about that with Stevenson Windermere, kind of how you wanted to?
No, the first book I wrote was similar, and even to I think a more dramatic degree, in that I wrote the book imagining what if my 4 best friends couldn't find jobs and became professional kidnappers. And they were the main characters in my book, these 4 friends of mine, all throughout the book. And Stevenson Windermere were I invented them because you need cops to chase you.
Right.
So they were essentially like the foils to these, my buddies who were traipsing around the country kidnapping people. And then at the end of the book, the publisher, as they do, says, "We really like this. Would you write a series based on your cops?" And I thought, my God, because I had set the cops. I had really not planned this. The kidnappers were nomadic, And so they traveled around, I started the book in Chicago randomly. They went up to Minnesota, again, randomly, and that's where, plot-wise, I needed cops. So I invented the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension cop, and then I needed an FBI agent, so then they had to pair up, and that's how, and then they chased them around the country. And I didn't know,
Ending in a train yard.
And yes, in Detroit. I didn't know a damn thing about Minnesota beyond the very basics that I'd seen passing through on a train. And I certainly didn't ever intend to write a series based on two cops set in Minnesota. If I had been thinking, I would have set it in Detroit because I grew up in Windsor and at least I could fake some Detroit knowledge. But I had no inkling that a series would come. And the worst part of it was Stevens, my state policeman, is kind of a middle-aged family man. He's largely unremarkable, aside from his policing. The FBI agent, because I created her second, I needed to go the opposite direction, so I made her a young woman, and I thought I'm never going to deal with her again. So she's just going to be one of those stereotypical strong female characters who can, dismantle a nuclear bomb while fighting off 3 assassins in a cocktail dress and stilettos while reciting Japanese poetry. She's going to be like that cartoonish, like what men write women to be and then expect to get credit for writing a strong female character.
So you're coasting, is what you're saying.
Yeah, it was she was very one-dimensional, and because I didn't expect to have to, do 6 books about her, and then I had to go back and be like, okay, walk this back, create a human being, which has been super rewarding. She's my favorite character to write. She's a lot like me in many ways. I can also dismantle a nuclear bomb in an evening gown, but also she
look good doing it.
That's right. Working on the Japanese poetry. But no, she kind of deals with, she has her demons. She has kind of mental health, depression issues. She has some stuff in her past. And so it's really rewarding to invent that stuff about her and then to be kind of work through my own stuff through her. So it's worked out.
So if there's a character that's your doppelganger, it's really Windermere.
Pretty much. I mean, I think I'll probably grow into Stevens, hopefully, unremarkable middle-aged family man.
That'd
eventually.
be me. Yeah.
You're pretty remarkable.
I don't feel very remarkable.
Well, so I was on the way here. I was thinking about characters, and I was thinking about Peter Ash because, Peter is kind of like a multi-dimensional Jack Reacher.
Well, so there are all of these comparisons to Lee Child's character Jack Reacher, which I'm very flattered by because I'm a fan, but they're
Well, they don't do him justice.
Well, Reacher's really a Superman, right? And
Yeah.
and my guy is nothing but flaws.
Right.
He's screwed up in the head. He's he can't be inside. He's a little aggressive. He's but he cares about everybody. I mean, and he's really driven by, like Reacher wants to punish people.
Yeah.
It's all about revenge, and my main character is driven by the urge to help people, and that empathy piece.
Sure, yeah. Empathy and I think, a stronger sense of consequence. I always thought that Reacher's books, I like the Reacher books. I might like them more if he, kind of stumbled into a therapist half drunk one day and said, I've killed 40 people in the last 2 days in this town. I can't sleep at night. And, Peter Ash kind of has that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, Peter, I listened to John Sanford speak once, and I've read Lee Child talk about creating Reacher, and both of them talked about Sanford created Davenport to create the kind of character that a man would want to be and a woman would want to be with. And they did it very
Deliberately.
Yeah, deliberately. And I wondered, I read Light It Up, and this is not a joke. Peter Ash has washboard abs. He runs 20 miles. He's very fit. He's very, he's kind of an ideal man. And I went on a diet and started working out because I was like, I want to be Peter Ash. And to this day, I'll
Me
look at
too.
myself in the mirror and think, am I Peter Ash enough yet? So, like, was this a deliberate, that is not a joke. That is legit. Like, I red lighted up and I was like, all right,
no.
I'm cutting the cheeseburgers.
No, in part, right, it's wish fulfillment in a way, right?
Sure.
So I would love to be 32 and physically fit. But in part, I don't know, my first book came out and somebody said, so how much of you is in Peter Ash? And I just said, I just made him up. He's really nothing like me. And my wife is just laughing in the back of the room. And the more I do this, the more I realize that every book I give him some challenge that I'm working on in my own life. The first book was just this. I was writing it sort of as the recession really got worse and worse and worse. And the business that I ran at the time, I was a building inspector. So if you bought a house, you hire a guy like me to tell you what's wrong with it. And people stopped buying houses. So my business, took a nosedive. And I had written a book that I'd found I found a really good agent who is still my agent, and we'd found an editor who read it, who liked it, who suggested some changes, come back in 3 months. And 3 months later, the economy had absolutely tanked, and she had taken another job, and nobody was buying anything. And so my book didn't sell, my business was, and so of course I wrote a book about a guy whose world is closing in. And the aboutness of that first book is about, it's about economic inequality. It's about veterans coming home who've basically fought a war under false pretenses that has accomplished nothing, while the finance industry has made multi-billionaires, and people are getting thrown out of their houses. So it's that rage,
Sure.
quite honestly, about all of those things that were happening. Now, so that book took me 5 years to write. Oh, don't record that part, because I told me it only took me 3 years. But
And now they want a book a year.
Yeah,
So.
no. Well, no, and then we like this book. Would you write us another one? Can we see it in 12 months? And my wife, Margaret, who is the font of all wisdom, said, just say yes. And so I swallowed hard, and I can do that, I said, shaking. And so the second book is kind of this exhilaration of the first 30,000 words is just this headlong rush.
He is not lying. It begins in, like, literally in the trees in California.
Up in the redwoods.
Up in the redwoods, and it doesn't stop for breath for hundred pages.
Yeah, and it was, I don't know, I didn't know where it came from, but it was just this, holy crap, somebody wants to read a book that I write. And it was this utter kind of exhilaration mixed with fear.
Sure.
Gee, here's my dream, can I do it? And the third book was about, I don't know, my wife sort of kind of saving my life. I was totally stressed out about this process. I had spent 4 months trying to write a book that never materialized, and then I lucked into this meeting a guy in Colorado or in Phoenix who was going to grow pot, and so I threw out the book I'd been working on and started this new one, and kind of didn't come up for air for a long time, and Margaret, instead of murdering me in my sleep, which she could have done that, and I think that would have been justified. She just, kind of kept, slipping pizza under the door and kind of saved my life. And that book is about Peter saving June, who's his love interest, and then how she saves him as well. And sort of like, that was when I kind of realized, I am writing about my life in some way or another, which is a strange thing to do, but.
I mean, I think you were talking at the beginning about write what you know. And I think that's how you write what you know, is you take the experiences that you've had.
Right, the emotional center of your,
and apply them to, these insane experiences that you're writing about that you don't know.
All right, so I think we're out of time. All right. Yes, shall we sign some books?
Let's sign some books. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks, folks. All right.
This program was recorded on May 22nd, 2018. at the Ann Arbor District Library